Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Jerry Gardner, class of 1958, life trustee at the university, and father of Bradley Gardner, class of 1996. And I'm thrilled to be hosting all of you this evening. It was the protesters this past spring that inspired trustee Kathy Waller, Atlanta Alumni Network leader Carl Graham, and me to do something about the systemic racism that continues to plague our country. For too many years, we have given only lip service to the issues that our minority and disadvantaged communities have been dealing with for the past 400 years. We decided to reach out to our community leaders in Atlanta to learn more about the efforts that they and nonprofit organizations have been making for years. And we wanted to share this information with our university alumni, parents, and friends living in the Atlanta area. So we developed Challenging Racism in Atlanta, a monthly program featuring these organizational leaders, the issues they are dealing with, and the programs and the projects they have developed to deal with the impact of systemic racism on housing, education, healthcare, homelessness, poverty, and the mass incarceration of young Black men, to name a few. Tonight, I'm honored to introduce to you Nathaniel Smith, President and Chief Equity Officer of the Project for Southern Equity. A child of civil rights and an Atlanta native, Nathaniel Smith's advocacy was instrumental in the development and maintenance of affordable workforce housing within the Atlanta Beltline. Among his many accomplishments, the Huffington Post named Nathaniel as one of 8 up-and-coming Black leaders in the climate movement in 2017. He was also honored by Grist magazine that named him one of the Grist 50 in 2018. He was one of Atlanta Magazine's Atlanta 500 in 2019 and 2020, and Georgia Trend Magazine named him one of the most influential Georgians in 2018, 19, and 20. Nathaniel's work has been featured in U.S. News and World Report, the Chronicle of Philanthropy, Nonprofit Quarterly, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the Atlanta Voice, among others. He holds a bachelor's degree in urban studies from Morehouse College and a master's degree from the New School. As we begin this presentation, I want to encourage all of you to submit any questions you have through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Nathaniel?
Thank you, Jerry, so much for this opportunity to participate with the University of Rochester Atlanta alumni. I know how valuable and precious each individual who participated on or who is participating on this Zoom call, how valuable their time is. And so I just appreciate you choosing to spend an hour with us to talk about the urgency of the challenges that we're facing as it relates to structural racism, and why I believe that racial equity is our saving grace. That if we are going to undo the history of structural inequity, of white supremacy, of privilege, that the anti antidote for those challenges that we're facing today is racial equity. And that will be the premise of my time with you, is to really talk about that and move through how the Partnership for Southern Equity is working with our various partners to advance racial equity in Georgia, of course, metropolitan Atlanta, Georgia, and beyond. So we'll go to our first slide. So just as a quick commercial, again, the Partnership for Southern Equity works in Atlanta, Georgia, and in the South to advance policies and actions that promote racial equity and shared prosperity for all in Atlanta and the South. There are 4 primary areas that we focus on. Climate justice and energy equity is our one area that is our just energy portfolio. Our equitable development, which is our just growth portfolio. Our just opportunity work focuses on economic inclusion, and just health focuses on health equity. Next slide. This is just a collage of some of the work that we've had an opportunity to accomplish, from working in Clayton County to expand MARTA for the first time in over 40 years, to developing the first racial equity mapping tool in the South, the Metro Atlanta Equity Atlas, and also, of course, the various efforts that we've done to bring community together around policy issues, and even more so through our leadership development work. We have worked collectively with our various ecosystem of partners to advance what we call a new Southern agenda for racial equity and shared prosperity in the American South. Next slide. So for us as an organization, it's about changing systems and people in order to, again, undo the various challenges that we're facing. We have to go to the heart of the issue and really begin to undo the systems of injustice that we're facing. And through that, we lead with racial equity, believe in the power of building catalytic relationships, and we believe that relationships will be the piston that will drive change in our society. Growing again an equity ecosystem through what we call relationship acceleration work that is grounded in communities of color and low wealth communities, and guided, of course, by data and research. Next slide. So before I get started, I wanted to make sure that we all had a baseline understanding of the language that I'll be utilizing in my presentation. So first and foremost, I wanted to provide a definition of equity. And this is the definition that my organization utilizes and our partners utilize in advancing our work. So our definition of equity is simply just and fair inclusion. It's about realizing an equitable a society in which all can participate and prosper, and to work to create conditions that will allow all people to reach their full potential. And of course, we look at equity as a path from hope to change. So creating the conditions where all people can participate and prosper. And as I said before, if you can't remember all of that, just remember just and fair inclusion. Next slide. So some of you may have seen various pictographics of the difference between equity and equality. A lot of times, unfortunately, people use the term equity and inequality synonymously, and they are not the same. Equality, and this is just a graphic that was developed by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which I thought was very helpful. The top photo is equality, where each person is given the same exact bike, regardless of their particular height or condition. And as you can see, the only person that the bike worked for was the woman. But for the young man and for the tall guy and for the person that is physically disabled, that bike will not work for them. And that is equality, giving people the same in spite of their conditions, their context, their history, and expecting for that to work for them. Equity is working to ensure that all people have the vehicles toward justice that they need, or opportunity they need in order to be successful. And so equity is making sure that people have the bike, for this example, that is their size and their specifications, their required specifications, in order for them to benefit and prosper from that opportunity. Next slide. So I wanted to really start this presentation by providing this photo of really beautiful young children from my perspective. And as you can see, this is a photo of various of kids that are from various backgrounds and ethnicities and races. And the reason why I wanted to provide this as a point of departure is not only because these are, beautiful young children, but what you're looking at really is the future of our nation. This will be our nation very, very soon. And if we don't understand that, then we will not understand how, again, racial equity is our saving grace. Next slide. So we know that again, the demographics in our nation and state are shifting tremendously, and these are some data points that I wanted to share to just show that. In 1980, 72% of Georgia's population was white. Today, 54% of Georgia's youth under the age of 18 are people of color. In 2014, there were more than 20 million children under 5 years old living in the US, and 50.2% of them were children of color. Nationally, by 2021, the majority of workers 25 to 34 will be workers of color. Working age population will become non-white by 2039. You know, that is what they are looking, what they see through their projections. And only 20% of today's seniors are people of color, but 46% of today's youth are people of color. And so the youth are depending on decisions made by this population to invest in education and infrastructure. So we're beginning to see not only a racial divide happening, and we're seeing that in many ways politically, but we also are seeing a generational divide. And we have to understand that as we move forward. Next slide. I also wanted to provide a photo of a map that was developed by Raj Chetney from Harvard University. And this slide basically, well, this photo rather, this heat map is showing the challenges that young people who were born poor, what are their chances to actually rise the 20%, the top 20% of income distribution, if their parents started at the bottom 20%. And again, this map really breaks down this idea of the American dream, that we were taught that if we work hard enough, that we would be able to get to the level of success that we have worked hard to achieve. And what we're learning from the data is that the American dream is dying in many ways. And unfortunately, to just give you the cliff notes, it is dying fastest in the South. And you can see that, you know, to give you the cliff notes, the dark red is bad. And so it is even more difficult for a poor child to rise out of poverty in the South than any other part of the nation. And unfortunately, in Atlanta, a child only has a 4% chance to rise. A poor child only has a 5% chance to rise out of poverty in the city of Atlanta. And so we have to begin the process of beginning to deal with not only the racial divide, but the racial wealth divide that we're experiencing in our country, and really the withering of the American dream in many communities in our nation, and in particular in Atlanta, in the city of Atlanta. Next slide. So, of course, one of Atlanta and the world's greatest disciples, Dr. King, elevated this idea of what he called the network of mutuality. We're caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. We must understand that we cannot afford to turn our backs on the various communities that are suffering the most because of the challenges that we face around structural inequity and structural racism. We have to understand that their destiny is connected to our destiny, and that we must work together to ensure that we help to facilitate harmony in our city, in our nation, not only because it is the right thing to do, but our very destiny depends on it. Next slide. So in order for us to really understand how we're connected and how our destiny is dependent on it, we have to also embrace the reality that history is the present. And one of my other heroes, James Baldwin, he said that one of the things that has always afflicted the American reality and the American vision is this aversion to history. History is not something you read about in a book. History is not even the past, it is the present. And that is where we must start if we are to understand and fully feel the ramifications of structural racism, not only on communities of color, but on and Black people in particular, and historically disinvested communities of color, but all of us. Next slide. So we first have to begin with, if we're going to understand the effects of structural racism, we have to understand the extreme extraction of people and also land that affected people of African descent and Native American communities. The transatlantic slave trade, where the economic engine of the United States was taken, free labor utilized, and not just the South, but the free labor that uh, African slaves, people who were enslaved from Africa that their labor was leveraged in the South, affected other economies around the world. But now that we're specifically talking about the South, understanding how that extraction of African bodies and their bodies utilized to drive an economy through free labor has to be where we start to understand the history of structural racism and the taking of the land of Native Americans in order to, again, drive an economy that was facilitated through free labor is where we have to start the extreme extraction of people and land. Next slide. We also have to understand that a lot of the challenges that we face around structural racism are embedded in our public policies. So I wanted to provide this example of one. This was actually an example of an FHA underwriting, a policy in the FHA underwriting manual in the 1940s, where it says that if a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that property shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. A change in social or racial occupancy generally contributes to instability and a decline in values. So again, this was federal policy. This was policy that advanced an idea of explicit segregation, that the value that of communities was based on the color of a person's skin who lived in that community. And so now we see that, wow, if it would have been horrible enough if it stopped with the federal government, but the banks embraced this idea and said, we're going to decide about the value of communities based on the color of someone's skin and draw a red circle around those communities that we felt were not as valuable as other communities. And which of course, not only sucked out the wealth of certain communities, but minimized wealth creation in other communities in those same communities. And it would have been enough if it stopped there. But the realtors steered families who had resources away from some of those communities because of this idea of value of value placed on the color of someone's skin, and this hierarchy of value based on the color of someone's skin. And again, last but certainly not least, that would have been enough. But the speculators would actually go into white communities and say, Black people are moving in, you need to hurry up and move out, and we will buy your home for you at a decent amount, but turn around and sell those homes to Black communities for 3 times the cost of those homes. So again, we see this conspiracy of inequity that has perpetuated itself from the beginning of this nation in 1619, when the slave trade began, all the way to the racialization of our policies, and just provide an example in our housing and real estate and economic development policies. Next slide. So this is, again, some people may say, well, that was the past. And how does this affect Atlanta now? Well, if you remember what I told you about the FHA underwriting manual and the challenges that Black people in particular have faced in Atlanta to have access to banking opportunities, economic development opportunities. And if you can see, this is an old World War II redlining map, where the communities, again, through the financial sector and the city, broke down communities as best, still desirable, definitely declining, and hazardous. And just again, because we don't have a lot of time, the red areas that were hazardous were where Black people lived in the city of Atlanta. And now, even when that happened in the 40s, today, right now, 80% of Black children live in high poverty areas in the city of Atlanta, while only 6% of white kids live in high poverty areas. Atlanta is number 2 for the lack of economic mobility for poor kids, and number 1 for income inequality. So again, this history is the present proposition. It's something that we must understand if we are to move towards a more just and inclusive future, and in particular, a more just and inclusive Atlanta. We can continue to try to elevate this idea. And yes, I'm a product of Black excellence in the city of Atlanta, but there are far too many Black children and Black communities, in particular Native Atlantans, Black Atlantans, that are being left behind by our economy. And we must understand the history and how this happened if we are to move forward to create a more racially just city, region, state, and nation. Next slide. So this is one of my favorite cartoons, and I utilize it a lot in my presentation. This is a proctor giving a test to some animals. You see the elephant, penguin, monkey, bird, snake, and goat, and seal, and fish. And the proctor says to the people who are taking the test, the animals that were taking the test, for a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. Well, of course, for the monkey and the snake and the bird, it may be easy to do. But for the penguin, the elephant, and the fish, it may not be that easy. And so again, we have this idea that the same rules be will affect communities in the same way. And as the rules continue to be shifted and shaped to benefit certain segment of our community, we're losing a lot of our talent and other key aspects of our community behind, because again of the not only the past but the current negative externalities caused by structural racism and white supremacy. Next slide. So this is just another quote that I really appreciate by Aristotle. He said that there is nothing so unequal as the equal treatment of unequals, and I think that that cartoon, I think this amplifies what the cartoon is trying to explain. Next slide. So here is some additional data that I just wanted to provide so you can just understand how racialized the challenges we're facing in Metro Atlanta are. And again, this data came out before COVID-19, so I would submit to you that the data is probably worse now. So here's from a Metro Atlanta snapshot from the Atlanta Regional Commission's Metro Atlanta Speak survey. They looked at the 13 county metro region, and they saw from the survey that the respondents of color who participated in the survey were more likely than white respondents to report experiencing food insecurity. They were unable to pay for a $400 emergency, experienced displacement and gentrification. They talked about the challenges around them being able to afford alternative housing, replacing of legacy businesses, that they would have an issue with that. And now we know with the COVID data that 40% of Black businesses were closed as a result of COVID. How will they have an opportunity to come back? We also know that 40% of all metro area workers have jobs that pay less than $15 an hour, which is the living wage. And so if you look at the cost for housing, a one bedroom, $18.12 in Atlanta, the average 21.27 for a 2 bedroom, and 27.44. The folks that are making less than $15 an hour can't afford these housing options. And of course, we know historically that the employment rate for African Americans is usually double that of whites, and it continues to be that today. Next slide. So here is some more data that really kind of lays out again the challenges that we face because of history being the present. This is a breakdown of media net worth by race from 1984 to 2009, where in 1984 the median net worth for whites was 90,851. For Blacks, it was 5,781. And if we go to 2009, 265,000 versus 28.5. And again, a lot of the wealth accumulated by African Americans in particular has come from home ownership. And so if the opportunities for home ownership and other opportunities to accumulate wealth have been minimized, you can see the expansion of the divide in terms of the racial wealth gap between whites and blacks between 1984 and 2009. And just to kind of push this, today the typical black family has only 10 cents for every dollar held by a white family. And also black families where the head graduated from college has less wealth than white families where the head dropped out of high school. So again, it's very difficult to not understand how structural racism is playing a role in the challenges that black communities and other historically disinvested communities of color are facing. And that is why we have to continue to fight the scourge of structural racism head on and not allow be turned away from it to focus on other things. We have to continue to fight this fight that others have begun, that others began this summer, and even beyond this summer, of course, the civil rights movement and all, the abolitionists and other people who continue to try to fight this fight since since we've had this challenge in our nation. Next slide. So this is just some more data. I won't really break this down too much. The only one that I really focus on is the first one, and that is the median household income in Atlanta for a white family is $83,722 compared to $28,105 for a black family. So again, we're seeing the racial wealth divide that has been perpetuated because of structural racism, and in order to close that gap, we have to tackle those challenges head on and work together to advance racial equity. Next slide. So we have to acknowledge, if you can hit it one more time, that extreme extraction equals extreme inequity. That our nation's history and the South's history of structural racism and exploitation is embedded in our economic systems, and in addition to that, our land use systems and our environmental systems. And so you cannot forget that because it is so deeply embedded, that it perpetuates itself in so many ways where individuals may not necessarily be behind the curtain pulling the lever. The lever now is on cruise control. And so what can we do systemically and through our relationships to change cruise control and move away from autopilot to make sure that we can begin to move towards a more harmonious and inclusive world in city and state. Next slide. So these are just some quotes from the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal, or the United Nations, that just really talks about the importance of really shrinking the wealth gap, and how the relationship between the people that are doing well and people that aren't doing so well affects the ability for local jurisdictions to remain competitive and grow economically, which again speaks to the importance of us understanding that we are in a network of mutuality, as Dr. King talked about. Next slide. So I wanted to kind of move quickly to talk a little bit about some of the work that PSC is doing, and I'll move quickly because I want to provide time for us to work. So in our Just Opportunity portfolio, we define economic inclusion as increasing equity in the distribution of income, wealth building, employment, and entrepreneurial opportunities for vulnerable populations. Next slide. And so for us, we try to work with our partners to realize a more equitable region where all residents, regardless of race and ethnicity and gender or neighborhood of residence, are fully able to participate in the economic vitality of our region. Next slide. And this slide really just breaks down, and this came from some research that we did, that if we're able to remove racism from our economy and why people are hired and not hired, that America would have gained $2.4 trillion in GDP in 2014. And it goes down the line. 150 of the largest metro areas would have 24% GDP increase. The earning gap would increase the GDP by 5 trillion a year, and closing the achievement gap between whites and black folks would increase the GDP by 310 to 525 billion. And these statistics, of course, come from McKinsey and other groups that are really beginning to show that it is not just about, of course, from our perspective, the moral thing to do, but again, we will not be able to save ourselves without focus on creating opportunities for all people to participate and prosper in our communities. Next slide. So in Georgia, if we were able to achieve full employment and remove structural racism from the agenda, from the agenda and gender, that would have brought 384,000 people ages 16 or older into employment. The economy could have been $12 billion stronger every year, and an additional 2.4 billion in new state and local revenue a year would have been achieved. Right. So in Metro Atlanta, it would have been a 6.9 billion increase in GDP. So again, equity, racial equity is good for our economy. And we have to understand it as we move forward collectively to advance racial equity. Next slide. So my proposition to you is that inequity is actually inefficient, that equity is more efficient than inequity. And if we're not, again, working to ensure that communities of color, Black community, people in the Black community, as well as historically disinvested communities of color are involved in our economy, we're advancing the economy with one arm tied behind our backs. Next slide. So here are some other examples of our work. Next slide. So our Just Growth portfolio focuses a great deal on land use. And I talked a lot about how federal policy and other policies have racialized our land use decision-making and planning policies. And with our partners, we work to advance racial equity within the context of our transit system, housing, our gray and green infrastructure opportunities, and also try our best to create tools that will not only help the community organize around development opportunities, but also support developers who want to develop in a more equitable and inclusive way. And that will, the Equitable Development Implementation Tool is a tool that we're developing to do that right now. Our Metro Atlanta Equity Atlas, you can go to atlantaequityatlas.com. We're actually updating it now. Again, providing maps and other data to assist people in understanding the challenges that we face around inequities per county in our 10-county Metro Atlanta area. Next slide. And so for Just Growth, again, it's about these moments of opportunity and working with our Just Growth Circle, which consists of about 40 different organizations now that are working with us to advance a just growth agenda in the city of Atlanta and in the region, and leveraging those moments of opportunity in a way that will allow us to influence new infrastructure, influence how old infrastructure is retired, and also on the health and climate perspective, help to ensure that the city is a resilient city and a regenerative city, and a racially just city. We believe as an organization that a city cannot be resilient if it is not just. And that is a lot of the work of the Just Growth portfolio. Next slide. And again, I talked a little bit about the Just Growth circles. They are bound by a set of principles. These are the 4 principles that connect the various members of the Just Growth circle. Next slide. These are some of the members of the Just Growth Circle who are working with us to advance our work. You can also see on the right, there's a report that we did, Opportunity Deferred, Race, Transportation, and the Future of Metropolitan Atlanta. We also did a systems map around gentrification in the city. But for us, really, it's about learning, coming together, and working to advance a just growth agenda for the city and the region. Next slide. We also do a great deal of work around leadership development. And these are some of the leadership programs that fall under our Just Growth portfolio. We have a Resident Leaders for Equity program where we're training community residents on how to engage around equity issues. We have another academy, the Transformation Academy, that teaches residents and stakeholders about the history of race and land use in our city, in our region. And we actually just completed the Transportation Safety Leaders Academy with the Atlanta Department of Transportation in one of the communities in the city of Atlanta to assist them in understanding how to advance land use in their communities that will create more safe infrastructure that they can utilize and to minimize traffic deaths and other challenges that they face. That most communities face that have limited investments in infrastructure. Next slide. We also have done a great deal of work with the City of Atlanta's Water Equity Task Force, working to develop not only a new focus area and efforts around how we can utilize green infrastructure as a way to advance equitable growth, but also how we can use that as a way to grow economies in communities that have been left behind by our current market. So right now there are conversations that we are engaged in with the city around a green infrastructure bond and working with them to develop a local hiring policy around the infrastructure bond, which will allow opportunities for Black community residents and other long-term residents to have access to job opportunities through the green infrastructure bond. Next slide. Again, I talked earlier about the Power of the Penny campaign, where we worked with the community, faith community and others to expand MARTA for the first time in over 40 years in Clayton County. You know, Clayton was a place that had lost their public transportation. People were forced to either move out or be exploited by alternative modes of transportation. We saw mothers pushing their babies down the street because they didn't have adequate infrastructure. And we worked with the community again to pass a $13 million referendum that expanded MARTA into Clayton through an effort that we call Power of the Penny. Next slide. So we did a great deal of organizing in the community with young people, with elected officials, with the faith community, and really worked with also State Representative Michael Glanton and the council at the time and the chair to pass the referendum. And we were really encouraged because we know that economic development follows new infrastructure. And so now Clayton, being one of the most challenged counties in the region, now has a transportation lifeline, and hopefully the infrastructure will be able to grow because of what we were able to accomplish a few years ago with the community. Next slide. Our Just Opportunity portfolio, which are various organizations that are working with us to advance an economic inclusion agenda. You can see some of the reports that we've written as well: Growing the Future, the Case for Economic Inclusion in Metro Atlanta, Employment Equity, Putting Georgia on the Path to Inclusive Prosperity, again, working to create an economy that works for everyone. And that is the work of the Just Opportunity portfolio and the Just Opportunity Circle members. Next slide. So I talked about that, the Circle group of key regional stakeholders that are working with us to advance an economic inclusion agenda. Next slide. Next slide. And these are, so with each area that we've organized, they're all connected by a set of principles. You saw the principles that connect the Just Growth Circle. These are the 6 principles of economic inclusion that connect the Just Opportunity Circle. That we have to account for the financial well-being of families, access to equitable educational opportunities with system support, a key to successful economic development efforts, and so on and so forth. But these are the various principles that the members of the Just Opportunity Circle have embraced and are leveraging to work in order to work collectively to advance the economic inclusion agenda in the region. Next slide. A couple of years ago, we had an awesome summit, the Just Opportunity Summit, where we brought over almost 400 key leaders from around the country actually that came and to Morehouse College to talk about the importance of an economic inclusion agenda that is centered in racial equity. We had a great turnout, great sessions, and learned a great deal from the summit. Next slide. We're also now in the process through a steering committee have organized Just Business Roundtable, where we have now close to 22 leaders representing larger employers in the city that are working with us on beginning the process of developing a corporate racial equity strategy for the city. We're very excited about it. And stay tuned. Stay tuned. We're working on this as we speak, and I'm really thankful that we've had a chance to work with our partners now for over a year in preparing for this moment. Next slide. So here are just some examples of how racial equity can be realized through economic inclusion, whether it be financial training and access, inclusive employment opportunities, entrepreneurship and business development, education, workforce development, supporting community leaders, supporting anchor institutions that support communities of color, and also research. All of these various strategies can be used to advance racial equity in our economy. Next slide. So it will take, again, the work to be centered in racial equity in order for us to get past these unfortunate times that we're in. And I know that for some, it may be very difficult to turn away from what you all have been taught. And especially when you've been taught by people who you care about and respect and love. But it is time for a new way forward. And that new way forward has to acknowledge and understand the role of structural racism on not just hurting communities of color, but everybody. When many of these counties in Metro Atlanta don't allow MARTA in because of some preconceived notions that they have about communities of color and how it may affect their markets and their housing values. As a result of that, we all sit in traffic. I have yet to see Black traffic or white traffic or Latino traffic. We all sit in traffic. So again, the legacy of structural racism doesn't just hurt Black people or communities of color. It hurts all of us. And the challenges that we face around traffic are a prime example of that. Next slide. So we need a new covenant for inclusive prosperity. And it's going to require every segment of our community, the public sector, private sector, nonprofit sector, philanthropy. One sector will not be able to solve the issues that we face around structural inequity, and in particular around structural racism. We all have to play our part in moving that effort forward. And these are just some key areas that each sector can help to lead in order to advance a racial equity agenda. Next slide. So I wanted to leave you all, and I'm trying to move as quickly as I can with some questions that will hopefully help you think when you sign off and reflect on my presentation. The first question is, what role has the culture of development played in sustaining racial, spatial, and economic inequity in Atlanta? Next slide. What would an economy look like that views everyone as an asset and no one a liability? Next slide. What would a Metro Atlanta look like that treats all its members equitably? And so, again, I think things are changing. We'll see. This is just an example of how things are changing from an economic development perspective. In 1997, the Business Roundtable focused more on corporate stakeholders, on ensuring that the stakeholders that the success of a business is dependent upon how they're treating their stockholders and the benefits of the work of the stock of their work on shares and stockholders. Today, it is more inclusive, and now the Business Roundtable is focused on the idea that Americans deserve an economy that allows each person to succeed, and it's not just about the stockholders. So again, you know, things are moving potentially in the right direction. Next slide. So, you know, I wanted to end with a call for action, and that, you know, I'm just so appreciative that the University of Rochester Atlanta alumni chapter has created this opportunity for y'all to have these deeper conversations, but it can't stop there. You know, my hope is that you all will not only learn from the various presentations that you are participating in, but understand that there's an urgency around the work. There's an urgency of now that requires you to move beyond learning towards action. And our future will depend, our ability to be more inclusive, to be more competitive, to be more just, will depend on your willingness to engage in this movement, that is being realized right now, in Atlanta and beyond. Next slide. So if you've been in Atlanta long enough, I'm sure you've heard of a man by the name of Tom Cousins. He was the founder of Cousins Properties, and has done a lot of good work in the community, philanthropic work in the community. And I wanted to leave with a quote. It's a fairly long quote, but basically this quote, basically, Mr. Cousins is saying that he believes that the greatest untapped resource is a human capital trapped in the neighborhoods of concentrated poverty. That there is an opportunity to you know, exceed our moral calling as well as our economic imperative, if we are able to see both as critical, in our evolution as a community, and our ability to remain competitive in a global economy. so so I will, next slide. And I almost forgot about this. You know, for me, it's about a values revolution, right? It's, and Dr. King talked about it, that we must shift the way that we look at what is important and focus on people and not just things. And I really believe that the work is just as much about a values revolution as it is about a policy revolution. And in many ways, policy in essence is just a reflection of the values of people in power. So they're both pretty much the same, but we have to understand that they're both connected. Next slide. So again, I will stop there. You know, again, I'm just so thankful and appreciative of the opportunity, and I guess we'll just open up the floor now for Q&A, Jerry, if anybody has any questions. But again, thank you again for the opportunity. You're on mute, Jerry. You're on mute. It's okay.
Oh, I'm on.
There you go. There you go. There you go.
Thank you, Nathaniel.
Oh, no problem.
And thank you for your presentation. You sure have demonstrated how structural racism has begun and continues to disadvantage the communities, the people in these disadvantaged communities. And I think you're absolutely right. It's a valuable asset that we have with all these people in these communities, and we've got to tap these valuable assets. We do have a couple of questions here before you leave. Why should Atlanta lead the charge to advance racial equity in America?
Well, I mean, I think we have a legacy of first being the logistical home of the civil rights movement. Many of our great leaders, you know, from, you know, Martin Luther King Jr. To you know, Joseph Lowry and other great leaders who we've lost recently, Hosea Williams, you know, and other unsung heroes, you know, have really led the way for the nation. And I believe that, you know, since, if we want to be honest, the challenges that we face around structural racism originated in the South, right? The original sin of slavery began in the South. and that Atlanta being the capital of the South in many ways, that we must, if we're going to lead the way in other areas, we also have to be willing to lead the way in realizing justice and realizing and racial equity for all.
Thank you, Nathan. What can white allies, advocates do to advance racial equity?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing that white allies and advocates, and let me be clear, Jerry, I do think that there's a difference between being a white ally and a white advocate, right? I mean, I think that now we are at a place where we need more whites who are willing, like we saw in the summer, to stand with communities of color as advocates and not just allies. And so, but I think for both of them, I think it requires you to listen, to understand and not respond. I think it's very important to do that. I think it's also important for the white community, in particular, people who want to be advocates or allies, to not stop at what you're willing to give for racial justice, but what are you willing to give up for racial justice? I think those are two different things. And then also, I think, there are many, many organizations, smaller organizations that would benefit greatly from your relationships. The hoarding of relationships is another place where structural racism has realized itself, and there's a lot of research around that. And how are you leveraging your relationships to advance racial equity, not just your money? I think that's something that's really important for white allies and advocates to think about.
Thanks, Nathaniel. In a presentation you made in Denver in April 2019, you talked about the transformational power of love. Tell us more about that.
Well, if you think about many of our greatest leaders, the ones that have really been able to transform people as well as policy, I think that they have all understood the transformational power of love. And again, when I talk about that, I'm not just talking about something that is superficial or puppy love, so to speak. What I'm talking about is the love that you have for your children or your grandkids or other young people, and having that same love for someone else's child, someone else's grandchild, someone else's loved one, being able to translate that same amount of love when you see other children living in substandard conditions, and wanting to do all you can to ensure that those children have the same opportunities that your kids have. For me, that is where love, that is when love can become a transformational force. And that is really what I continue to tell my staff and people who work with us, that at the end of the day, the most powerful uh, facilitator for change that we have, in my opinion, is love. And we have to understand that, but we also have to be willing to put ourselves on the line for it.
That certainly ties in with how important it is to value and respect other people. Um, how can we go about changing the attitudes, thinking, and the beliefs of people so they are more willing to accept and work with people who don't look like them?
Again, I mean, I think is one of the things that we try our best to do with our equity circles and through our leadership programs is to create safe spaces for people to ask provocative questions sometimes, or to learn. It's important to create those safe spaces for people to reach and maybe even unlearn some of the things that they've been taught. But at the same time, those spaces should not be spaces that are coddling, if you understand what I'm saying, Jerry. Like, we have to continue to push as well, because that is the only way that a new world can be born, right? I mean, we have to consider ourselves the midwives, right, for a new world that we're working to give birth to, right? So there's a little pain that has to come from that birth, but we can create spaces that are as comfortable, that we can make as comfortable as possible for that new world to come. And so creating safe spaces, I would also say, going again back to this idea of listening to understand and not just to respond. And to also, I think, you know, if you really think about the relationships that you have, I mean, how diverse are your friends, right? How connected are you to some of the communities that I talked about today in my presentation? What are you doing in order to kind of see what living like that is actually like for those individuals? I think the one of the biggest muscles that we have to continue to try to strengthen in our body is the empathy muscle, right? Our ability to feel and try to understand what other people are going through. You can't grow that empathy muscle unless you put yourself in those positions that will help you grow those muscles. And so, that is one of the key things that we must do if we want to move forward.
Thank you. We have one last question from Mary. And she wants to know your thoughts about Cory Booker's idea of giving $1,000 bond to newborns.
Well, I mean, I think so I think it's a complicated question, because the issues that we face around structural racism go beyond economics. It is a what I call a bankruptcy of empathy and more morality, right? There's a bankruptcy of the soul that has created the conditions for structural racism to perpetuate itself. And with that being said, any opportunity that we have to support people financially in order to navigate through the issues of structural racism, I support. But there's a difference between navigation and transformation, right? A baby bond will not transform our communities and transform the systems that our children are facing, our brown and black children are facing. And with that being said, and I consider myself someone who is very much committed to creating an inclusive economy. But at the end of the day, we also have to embrace the fact that we will never be able to buy our way into racial justice. There's not enough money in the world that will allow us to do that, because it is a moral problem that we have. And so I'm definitely open to entertaining it. We just have to be clear about what the outcomes are, what the outcomes are, and not expect for it to do something that, giving kids $1,000 baby bond may or may not be able to do. We just have to understand that.
Very, very excellent observation, Nathaniel. Thank you so much. And I want to thank you again for taking time to meet with us this evening.
No, thank you, Jerry.
Very best wishes to you and your colleagues on the very, very important work that you're doing here in the Atlanta area, and also the Southeast and around the nation. And I want to also thank all of our people who have joined us tonight, and we hope you enjoyed the program. We'd also like to invite you to our next Challenging Racism in Atlanta program. And that'll be Wednesday, March 31st at 7 p.m., featuring Dr. Lisa Herring, Superintendent of Atlanta Public Schools. And we'll send you additional information before that presentation. So as the clock strikes 8, we say goodbye and thank you again for participating. We're looking forward to seeing you join us again. Thanks again, Nathaniel.
Take care, everybody. Thank you so much.